Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar today on the VOCA Emergency Fund Training. This is Shannon, the Training and Technical Assistance Manager with CCADV. Excited to have Jen Doe here with us today from COVA as our trainer, and I know she's excited about sharing her information today as well. So a few housekeeping tips. Again, everyone is in mute so that we can all listen to Jen. If you have a question throughout the presentation, feel free to type that into the question box, and then we'll be able to see that and can just reply to you, or Jen will be able to address it throughout the presentation. If you have something and that you want to share and you're okay with everyone seeing it, then you'll see that little chat box. Feel free to type it into there. And throughout the presentation, there are a couple of opportunities for you to share that Jen's actually going to ask you to share in that chat box as well. So we'll invite everyone to do that, to stay engaged and with us throughout this presentation. We do want to let everyone know again that this webinar is being recorded. So it will then also be posted on CCADV's website, and we'll also have a link on COVA's to be shared as well for you in the future. There is one handout for you in the little handout section there, and we will send that in a follow-up email as well, so you've got some of that. So now that those housekeeping things are out of the way, we'd like to say welcome to Jen.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. This is Jen Doe. I am a trainer with the Colorado Organization for Victim Assistance, or COVA, and I'm very happy to be here today to share with you all some information about our emergency fund. I've been doing a lot of training on this around the state and metro area, and I think it's been really helpful for people to get to know a little bit of the specifics around this, and then also some of the scenarios that we've seen and what we can and cannot do with our emergency fund. So that's what we're going to be doing today. A little bit about me. Prior to working for COVA, I have been working in prevention and education for a little over 5 years. So worked at the Auraria campus doing prevention work with college students, and then worked for Safe Shelter of St. Vrain Valley up in Longmont doing outreach and education, volunteer management and training, as well as, you know, a little direct services sprinkled in there because I always worked for small nonprofits, and anyone who's done that probably knows that you wear a lot of hats. So that's just a little bit about my background, and I've been with COVA since this spring, so happy to be there and happy to be with you all today. Before we get into the emergency fund, I just want to give just a quick overview of some of the programs that COVA operates. So we are the largest membership organization in Colorado that works with victim services organizations. So aside from our human trafficking program, we don't really do direct client services. We primarily are there to assist victim services organizations in a variety of ways. So we do an annual Victim Advocate Academy, as well as an annual conference. The conference is coming up in October, so registration is currently open for that. We also offer support for communities in cases of mass tragedies if they're requested. So if a community experiences a mass tragedy and it really overwhelms their resources, we can come in and provide some assistance with that. We do offer a lot of training and technical assistance, so doing webinars like this, offering trainings in person in the metro area, as well as regional trainings around the state. So next month we'll be going to Southwest Colorado for about a week, and we'll be doing a bunch of regional trainings down there. You can always go to our website to see what trainings we have coming up. We also offer victim services internships. So for students who are wanting to get involved in the victim services field and need internship credit, they can apply to be an intern with COVA, and then we work with host agencies and can place those interns in host agencies. We have some grant funding that allows us to pay them a little bit for their time. So it's really a win-win for the intern and the organization. So if you're interested in that, you can also learn more on our website. I mentioned that we do provide case management for victims of human trafficking. We also currently are involved in a victim offender dialogue study. So we're working with the University of Denver to do some research around high-risk victim offender dialogue, which is a form of restorative justice that is victim-initiated. We provide certification to advocates, both on a voluntary basis, so for people who just kind of want to have some certificate that acknowledges all of their time and training, we can do that. We also work with the Domestic Violence Offender Management Board to kind of help oversee their certificate credentialing, so we review those things in partnership with them. We have our emergency fund, which I'll get into today. Also do a lot of public policy work, so we're down at the Capitol during session and trying to keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on in the victim services community and advocate for the needs of victims on a policy level. And then we have a large online directory also on our website. So that's just a little bit about COVA. And we will go ahead and talk now about the emergency fund. Please feel free to ask questions as we're going. I will leave time at the end, and I'll kind of give an overview of what the emergency fund is, how it works, what it can and can't do, and then we're going to go through a couple of scenarios, and that'll give you a better idea of kind of what are some of the things that we've seen that we've been able to do or not do. So before we get into that, I'd love to know who is on the call. So there is a poll open there. Please go ahead and indicate who you are, what part of the field you work in.
We'll give you just a few more seconds if everyone can fill that out. Let us know what you work in. And again, if you are other, make sure you type into the chat box and let us know how you would classify yourself as an other in that chat box so we might know who else is with us. And it looks like all right. So we're going to give you about 5 more seconds to finish letting us know who you are. And then we're going to go ahead and close that poll. So we've got 67% with us today are community-based advocates. We have 24% that are systems-based advocates, 3% that are attorneys, and then we have 6% that are other. And in our other, we've had some, hang on just a second, someone with a victim response unit mentioned here. And that's really all we see in the other that people typed in, some victim advocates as well and community-based advocates as well.
All right, great, thank you so much. All right, so some of you may have heard of the emergency fund, may have even utilized our emergency fund, and I want to first kind of talk a little bit about the history. I can't share, I can't click. So we have kind of 2 separate pots of money. So if you access the emergency fund prior to January of this year, that's different than the emergency fund that we've started administering since January of this year. Okay, so you'll see on the screen, we have our COVA funds. That's what I'm going to refer to that. So that's the fund that we've been operating for several years. We have about $50,000 a year in that pot of money that we're able to administer to victims of crime. That money is funded through state VAIL, whereas our new fund that we started administering in January is VOCA funding. So those are federal dollars. And if anyone knows about working with federal dollars, you may know that federal dollars bring a lot of federal restrictions. So that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is what some of those restrictions are, but we do still have that state VAIL fund, so we still have that pot of money from state funding that's $50,000 a year, and then we also have this VOCA funding that's about $1 million per year that we're able to administer. So that's the difference between those two. The way that this came about, this new VOCA fund, was that the Division of Criminal Justice Office for Victims Programs did a needs assessment in 2015 and determined 3 priority areas that were really needed for victim service providers across the state. Civil legal services was one of those, housing was another, and then emergency funds was the third. So due to kind of an influx in VOCA funding that we've seen over the last couple of years, they were able to create this VOCA emergency fund, and because of COVA's previous experience administering emergency funds, we were designated as the administrators for this new VOCA fund as well. So who can use the emergency fund? Would be advocates working within victim services agencies in Colorado. So as we talk about the application process, it's really important to note that applications for the emergency fund do have to come from an advocate who is a trained victim advocate. So we know that there may be people in sort of allied fields, maybe people working within other sorts of housing and homelessness organizations, or possibly within substance abuse agencies that may be working with people who could benefit from this emergency fund who have been victims of crime. But we do ask that applications come from a victim advocate or from someone within an agency where their primary role or mission is providing victim services. And that's really just so that we can ensure that the folks that are accessing these funds are able to be connected with a victim advocate to ensure that they're getting as many of their needs met as possible. So working with somebody who's familiar with a lot of the different things that a crime victim might need throughout their process. So they do have to come from a trained victim advocate. We can't accept applications, and we also can't speak or advise or provide information directly with clients. So we are getting a lot of calls from individuals who say, I'm a victim of crime, and you know, I heard that you have this $1 million, and how do I get some of that? I need it. And we would, in those cases, actually direct that individual to an agency within their area that could provide them with that victim advocacy, and then they could work with that advocate to hopefully go through that application process if it seems like it would be a good fit. The application needs to be received within a reasonable amount of time since the crime occurred. So as I go through this training, you're going to hear me say things like reasonable amount of time, may, possibly, might. So that's just to make sure that I'm not saying we can or cannot do anything that I'm incorrect about. Because I'm not the person that administers, I don't know every situation, and we really do look at these things on a case-by-case basis. So when we say within a reasonable amount of time, that could be really varied depending on the circumstances of a given case. For example, if someone maybe was a victim of domestic violence and their most recent case or victimization occurred 8 months ago, and they were now, their advocate was applying for emergency funding to assist with rental, we might look at that and say, well, why is it that now, 8 months later, this individual needs this rental assistance? What has happened in that time? And it may turn out that perhaps their offender has been released and has started stalking them again, has violated a protection order, and they feel like for their safety, they need to relocate and need some assistance. So it's those kinds of circumstances that we're going to look for. So just making sure that when you're filling out an application or you're talking with someone at COVA about the circumstances, that you're being really clear about, you know, what is the most recent thing that has occurred that has kind of put this back into emergency status for this individual. The crime does have to have occurred in Colorado, and the victim would have to be currently in Colorado. So we've gotten a lot of questions where maybe someone had a crime occur in another state and they have family or support system here in Colorado, and an advocate calls us asking if we could assist with transportation to get them to Colorado. And unfortunately, in a case like that, we would not be able to help. But if it were the other way around, the crime happened in Colorado, and the victim is wanting to leave the state to go to a support system or a place that's going to be safer or have the resources they need, that is something that we could assist with. The one exception to that, or two exceptions to that, would be cases of mass violence or terrorism. So if someone was a resident of Colorado and they were on vacation or in another state for whatever reason, or even overseas internationally, and they were involved in a mass tragedy or an act of terrorism, and maybe they need assistance getting back to the U.S. or something has happened, we may be able to assist in those, but that would really be the only exception to that rule about the crime occurring in Colorado. Okay, everybody still with me? Excellent. So this VOCA emergency fund is also designed to be a last resort. So in order to access this fund, a crime doesn't have to have been reported to the police, but if it was, we're going to want you to have at least looked into victims' compensation on behalf of that individual. There are lots of things that victims' comp doesn't cover, and so those are things we may be able to cover. For instance, we get a lot of cases where the crime was reported to law enforcement and the victim has applied for compensation to cover medical or mental health costs, but they still maybe need some assistance with rental assistance. So maybe first month's rent so that they can move, or maybe they need assistance with childcare or something like that that victims' comp isn't able to cover. We may be able to come in and supplement victims' comp in those sorts of cases. So we're not going to generally be able to cover things that are eligible for victims' comp if the crime was reported. If it wasn't reported, that's a whole different story, and we understand that there are lots of cases and lots of reasons why someone would not report their crime to law enforcement, and we can still assist in those cases. So that's just something to keep in mind. Also, looking into other options for financial assistance, we're going to expect that that's been also explored first. So that could be things like programs through the Department of Human Services that may be able to assist with child care, for example, possibly with utility bills and things like that. We recognize that a lot of these programs can take a while for applications to process, or there may be wait lists. So we may still be able to assist kind of in the interim while someone is waiting for some of those other benefits to come through. But we are going to really ask that the advocate ensures that all of those other areas have been explored and make sure that we really are a last resort. So hopefully that makes sense. And it does put a lot of responsibility on the advocates to sort of do that research. So I recall last week at staff meeting, Carla, who is overseeing the emergency fund right now, said that on Monday she had received 10 applications. So we are getting tons of applications, and we're not trying to make this difficult for all of you. We just really are kind of overwhelmed by how popular this has become, and so we're still kind of trying to figure out a balance and aren't always able to assist. But if you reach out to us and there's something, we may say, hey, have you looked into this resource or this resource? So we can offer alternatives also if there's something that we aren't able to cover. Okay, so here you see a list of VOCA emergency fund eligible crimes. So very similar to the list of crimes that are covered under the Victim Rights Amendment in Colorado, but this does include some additional crimes like identity theft, fraud, or financial crimes, burglary, things like that. So arson, bullying, burglary, child physical abuse or neglect, or child pornography, sexual abuse or assault, domestic violence, family violence, DUI or DWI incidents, and we can kind of talk about what sorts of things would be covered there, elder abuse or neglect, human trafficking, either labor or sex trafficking, as I said, identity theft, fraud, financial crimes, kidnapping, mass violence, so that would be one of those examples of something that could happen overseas or in another state that we could potentially assist a Colorado resident with. Other sorts of vehicle victimization, so things like hit and run accidents, robbery, stalking. So survivors of homicide victims, so families who have lost a loved one or friends, close, loved ones would be able to apply for potentially some services around their own needs if they've lost someone to homicide. Teen dating abuse, terrorism, as I said before, is another one that would fall outside of the lines of having to be in Colorado, and then anything that would be classified as a hate crime or a bias-motivated crime. Any questions about any of the list of crimes?
If you have any questions, feel free to type them into either that chat box where everyone can see it or in those question box. A few of you have had questions as we've been going through this presentation, and we've been able to answer those questions privately. Again, we want to let everyone know that this is being recorded, and you will also have a copy of the slides to go along with the recording as well.
Okay, so what are the kinds of things that we are able to cover with the VOCA Emergency Fund? Things like clothing, food, and supplies, rental assistance, and I would say that the majority of what we have done with this fund up until now is rental assistance. That's probably the biggest need that we're seeing, and it's great that we're really able to assist people with those kinds of needs. So rental assistance, and primarily, I think the majority of folks that we're working with have been victims of domestic violence, but we are working with victims of all sorts of crimes as well. Emergency hotel stays, so that would be in the case where maybe someone can't get into shelter, all of the shelters are full, maybe it's Friday night and they need a place to stay for the weekend until they can figure something out. We may be able to assist with something like that. Utility assistance, so that could be starting up new utilities for someone who recently moved and or the current utility bill. Short-term nursing home or housing for victims of elder abuse victims. I just said victims twice. Child care expenses we may be able to assist with. Also things like travel, housing, and food expenses related to court hearings or court dates, and that could potentially extend to immediate family and people who are closely involved in that victim support network. Moving expenses, I think we've been seeing a lot more of that come up, so things like renting a U-Haul, potentially paying for a storage unit for someone for a short period of time until they can get into new housing. Relocation expenses, so that would be bus or plane tickets. Typically with this, we're talking about like a Greyhound ticket, not a local RTD bus. We could certainly refer out to other resources that might be able to do that sort of thing, but this is going to be generally Greyhound tickets or airline tickets that are going to be getting somebody out of town or out of the state. And then any of these expenses related to dependents of the primary victim.
And while you're on that, Jen, we did have someone who had a question kind of based on what you were talking about before with a mass situation happening somewhere where you guys might go and do some work. This funding that's available here, so if there's a refugees who are living here in Colorado, but they experienced mass violence abroad, could they be eligible for any of this funding?
Yeah, I think it's possible, if there is an emergency related to what they've experienced, that may be something we could assist with. I'm not sure if, I would have to double check. I'm not certain if they had to have been a resident in Colorado prior to experiencing a crime of mass violence, but I would think that that is something that we certainly could look at doing and in some cases may be able to assist with.
Great.
And I also wanted to note, so with the smaller COVA funds that I mentioned at the beginning, in the past we were only able to administer about $150 at a time with that funding and could only provide support once to an individual. Because we now have this other funding available, we're able to do a little bit more, so maybe more like $300 with that funding, and then we don't have the same kinds of caps with the VOCA emergency fund. So if it's something like rental assistance, it may be, you know, $1,000 or more. Moving expenses can get up there. So generally, we're looking at probably a cap of around $3,000 in a given situation with the VOCA fund, but it's a lot more flexible in terms of the amount that we can offer. And I believe that last month alone, I think we administered $60,000. So definitely, as more people find out about this, we're getting that funding out there, and that's what we want to do with it, and that's what our funders want us to do with it. So keep that in mind as well. Things that cannot be covered by this VOCA emergency fund. So we're never going to be able to pay a deposit. We do a lot of rental assistance. We can do first month's rent or a current month's rent, but we can't do deposits. And the reasoning behind that really just has to do with the fact that, you know, a deposit is something that is going to go back to someone at some point, and we can't track the entire life of that money. So we're able to offer that like first month's rent if someone else can come up with the deposit, if that victim can come up with a deposit or find other resources for that. So that's something to keep in mind as well. We also can't cover mortgages currently. That is one of the fund federal guidelines that is very restrictive, and I think this is something that is really unfortunate, and we're seeing as, you know, a real potential gap in services, that there is still a need. For example, we had a circumstance where a husband and wife were both victims of an armed robbery, and they were injured physically to the point that they were unable to work and were having trouble cover their mortgage. And we unfortunately weren't able to assist them with that. And so I think that has something to do with the way that mortgages are federally insured, or something like a mortgage is looked at as an asset. But that's something that our hands really are tied around. So keeping that in mind. Also, any sort of back payments or past due bills. So something that was due prior to the date that the crime occurred, we're generally not going to be able to assist with. There is one example that we just had come up recently where a woman was a victim of a robbery, and she had some past due utility bills and had been saving up money to cover this utility bill that was past due, and had just like gotten enough money to pay that utility bill and was robbed and lost that money. So that was a circumstance where we were able to assist. So there are often exceptions, but in general, we're not going to be able to cover something that occurred before the crime. Anything related to hardship. So if someone were to lose their job or get laid off, unless that's related directly to the crime, we're not going to be able to assist with that. So any sort of changes that are going to impact cash flow on an ongoing basis, because this is an emergency funding, we want to make sure that anything we're paying is really an emergency and is going to be able to be covered going forward. So things like rent or utilities, those ongoing bills, we just want to ensure that there's something in place for somebody to cover that later. So there are sometimes circumstances where, you know, someone has experienced a traumatic event, and because of the trauma, they're working really hard and they're really trying, and maybe for whatever reason are unable to keep their job. That may be one of those exceptions where we could come in and say, you know, we see that this person was working really hard and they're working on getting back on their feet. We can help out with this one-time, you know, rent payment or whatever it may be, to give them a little bit of time to take care of themselves to get back to where they need to be. So we understand that things happen, and my best advice is, if you have a question about a circumstance you're dealing with, you're not sure, give us a call and talk it through with one of our staff, and we'll see if we can figure something out. We also are really trying to be creative, so if there's something that we can't cover, say maybe there is a past due utility bill that we aren't able to cover, maybe we can cover a portion of the rent for that month to allow that person to save up money to cover that utility bill. So we can be creative, and there are also things that may not fall into the requirements or eligibility for the VOCA fund that COVA fund might be able to come in and cover, because we have a little bit more flexibility with that funding. We can't do gift cards and then auto-related expenses also, unless in very specific circumstances there was something that was directly related to a crime that insurance wouldn't cover or something like that. But in 99.9% of cases, we can't do auto-related expenses.
And we did have a question also, Jen, as you're talking about these things that are going to be covered and who it could apply to. Does being an undocumented citizen affect eligibility for any of these funds?
Absolutely not. Nope. So it does not matter. And as I said, it doesn't have to have been reported to law enforcement. So yeah, definitely let us know if that's something that you're dealing with, but it's not going to prevent somebody from being able to be eligible for these funds.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so what is the process to apply for emergency funding? So we do not have the application posted online or anything. You do have to request that. So you can call or send an email, and somebody can get you that application. We do have a fillable PDF that we can email, but we don't have it posted on our website because we don't want just anyone to be able to access that. We probably have a lot of victims coming and trying to fill out the form themselves, so you do have to request that, and that's just another way that we make sure that the people that are applying for this know about the emergency fund and are qualified to be able to do that.
Jen, real quick, just a back question as well, since one of the things you talked about was gift cards. Mm-hmm. Someone had a question regarding gas cards. Would gas cards for a relocation expense count the same as gift card, or could those be requested?
So most likely not. So what we can do in some cases is an agency could purchase a gas card for the crime victim, and then we may be able to reimburse. That would also go for things like clothing and food and supplies, where if all other resources weren't available and the agency that individual is working with had to pick up the bill for getting that person some new clothing or getting them a gas card, we may be able to assist with those things, but my recommendation is that even if you don't submit the application, that you do call us and at least kind of run through the scenario, because we don't want you to expend funds on behalf of a victim that you're working with and then not be able to get reimbursement from us. We will never reimburse a crime victim directly, but in some circumstances we can do reimbursement to an agency for some of those costs.
Okay, and as you're saying that, because I know there have been some questions around this as well, just to clarify, so either the crime victim that we're working with or the agency themselves would have to spend the money first. So for example, if you're paying rent, they would have to be able to have the money to pay the rent, fill out this application, and then hope for reimbursement?
No. So I think that is one of the myths that is floating around out there, is that a lot of people think that we are only doing reimbursement. In most cases, we can and actually prefer to pay a vendor directly. So we would need, for rent, for example, we would just need a copy of the lease that says, who the landlord is, how much the rent that is being requested. It would need to be signed by both the victim and the landlord. It would have to be in the victim's name. But that is something that we would pay directly to that vendor. The same with things like emergency hotel stays. We can cover that directly to that hotel, moving expenses, things like that. So we would ask that you, as the advocate, do that research, kind of figure out, what moving company you're going to use, what storage unit, what hotel, things like that, but we will actually pay directly to those vendors. And so that's another way that it does put a lot of responsibility on the advocate, but then also your agency doesn't have to put up that money. We can go ahead and make those direct payments.
Great, thank you, Jen.
Yeah, you're welcome. There's one other thing on the application that's just important to note, is we know that oftentimes community-based advocates who don't have necessarily obligations under the Victim Rights Amendment may not be as familiar with the Victim Rights Amendment as like law enforcement or systems-based victim advocates would. So what we've done is we want to ensure that even if the victim is choosing not to go through the criminal justice process, that they at least know what their rights are if they should make that decision. So what we've done is just attach a one-page victim rights sheet at the end of the application, and we're going to ask that you provide that to the client prior to submitting, and then you're just going to check a box on the application that says, yes, they have been provided with their rights. Does that make sense? Okay.
And then we have another quick question. How do you handle situations where a victim needs immediate or on-scene assistance and there isn't time to seek prior approval? So for example, a hotel, they need a hotel that day. How does it work for things like that?
Yeah, so there is actually someone on call for this emergency fund 24/7. So if it's after hours, it will forward to somebody's cell phone. So you generally should be able to reach somebody anytime. At least, like I said, at least maybe give us a call, run it through the scenario and say, is this something you think you'll be able to do? So usually there's going to be somebody available for that. If that's the whole question, I feel like there was another piece of it. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
If you have more to that question, feel free to type that into the question box, but I feel, Jen, like you answered that.
Okay. Okay, so once you've completed the application, you would return it via fax or email. Email is preferred. We are a nonprofit, and we have a nonprofit fax machine, so it's not always the most reliable. I would say either way, it never hurts to give us a call, 30 minutes later, just check and confirm that we've received it. Oh, and the other thing I was going to say is that typically we can turn these applications around pretty quickly, assuming that they're filled out, that we have all the documentation that we need, and that we don't have to follow up with a lot of questions. As long as we've got the money in the bank to pay out on something, we can usually get that turned around within a couple of days. So the way that this works from COVA's end is that we are distributing the emergency funds, and then we are submitting reimbursement requests to VOCA, which is why some of these restrictions and documentation are so important, is that if we don't have what we need and VOCA comes back and says, well, why do we not have this documentation, then we're already out that funding. And so that's just one of the things to keep in mind as well.
Okay, and so speaking of that, when you just talked about the fact that someone is available 24 hours, and obviously the importance of making sure everything is filled out and handled on both ends, is contacting the 24-hour on-call person preferable to doing it themselves, I guess, in a reimbursement scenario? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, I would say contact us, give us a call if you're working with someone and it's like over the weekend, just to make sure that it is something that we're going to be able to cover before you go ahead and cover that expense. If we can't cover it, we may be able to direct you to somebody, but I would just say, so that you're not out that money, contacting us is totally fine. That's what we're there for, and we would really prefer that to having you submit an application on Monday morning and then us not be able to follow through with that. Okay.
And then is it going to be in here, or is it on that handout that we have included for them here and that will also be emailed? What's the 24/7 contact method?
Yeah, so if you just call the main COVA number, 303-861-1160, and that will be on the last slide, it should either forward to someone, or the outgoing message, if it's after hours, will provide you with a number that you can call. But I believe that that's forwarding outside of business hours.
All right, thank you.
So being sure that you're including all relevant information and documentation in terms of submitting that application. So what are the reasons for the request? What are the general circumstances? What was the most recent date of the victimization or the circumstance that kind of put this person into a need for emergency funds? If it is something like rental assistance, as I mentioned, we would need a copy of at least the first and last page of the lease, something that says what the rent amount is, who the landlord is, and that it's going to have to be signed as well. Other bills, you know, if we're paying something like a utility bill, we would need a copy of that included. Things like moving expenses can sometimes get a little trickier because you don't necessarily have the full bill until after the move has been completed with mileage and all of that stuff. There have been a few cases where we've been able to find a vendor who will offer a flat rate. So you can always call us if you're struggling to find someone who you think would work with your client. You can give us a call. We may have some ideas. As we do more and more of this, you know, we are kind of finding out who we can work with, and there are some companies that are willing to give us deals. So even though we prefer that you do that research, you know, if you're struggling at all, please give us a call. If there are other things like childcare, it would need to be a bill or an invoice or at least an estimate. So all of those sorts of things. And I believe that the handout that is attached to this presentation has some basic information on the front side, and then on the back there is a chart that lays out some of those more specifics around documentation and what is required. But you can always give us a call before you send in the application and just make sure that you've got what you need.
While we're on that subject of documentation again, we just want to do another quick clarification and make sure, once again, that this is correct. So people can have access to the VOCA funds, correct, without reporting the crime to law enforcement, because again, we're running, right now we have a lot that we're working with who are undocumented and don't want to involve law enforcement, or as we know, those maybe being affected by sexual assaults or domestic violence also don't necessarily want to involve law enforcement. So just want to clarify that those VOCA funds are available for them in that case. And then is it the same for COVA funds, so the other funds that you have available? Does that apply as well?
Yes. So for any of these funds, we do not require that the crime was reported to law enforcement. We don't require that the person is a documented citizen, all of those things. So definitely don't let that sway you away from reaching out. We just would ask that if the crime has been reported, that you're not asking for anything that victims' comp could cover. Now, we also recognize that there are some times where victims' comp might deny something. Depending on the situation, we may be able to cover it. We're subject to a lot of the same restrictions that victims' comp is, so it's just going to depend on that circumstance. But if it's something where you feel like, you know, victims' comp denied this and it really should have been covered, or it's just something that wouldn't be covered by victims' comp, like rental assistance, then we can help out with those things. Okay. And, you know, the more complete the application, the faster we're able to process it. We know that you are all busy, and so if we get an application and we have to call and follow up with questions, it's not always easy to get a hold of advocates who are really busy and often working with clients all day long. So the more complete it is, the better. And if there are questions as you're filling out the application, you're not sure if what you're asking for is going to be covered, give us a call before you submit it, and we'll kind of talk you through what we can and can't do and see what kind of solution we can come up with for that given situation. Okay, so just some important reminders, and then we will go through a couple of scenarios. So we prefer generally to pay a vendor directly, but we can reimburse an agency if necessary. We just recommend that you check with us first so that you're not out that money. We will not be able to reimburse a victim directly. Generally, we need the advocate to do the research in terms of finding hotels, moving companies, you know, getting the information from the landlord. You know, if you're really struggling with those sorts of things, we may be able to help out. There are also some cases where, you know, maybe it's going to take us a week to get the rent check out and it's due tomorrow. You know, we may be able to call the landlord and just say, hey, you know, we're working with this person, we can mail the check on this date, and generally they're willing to work with us on that. We haven't had a lot of experiences where folks are not. When it comes to airline and things like Greyhound tickets, those are one exception where we'll actually do the research and find the tickets ourselves. So we'll work with the advocate to figure out what date and time is going to work for that person, but we'll kind of shop around and find the lowest price. We may be able to use credit card points and things like that to do those sorts of things. So that's something to keep in mind. The requests do have to be related to the crime. So keeping that in mind, if someone has lost their job and it's not really related to the crime, but now they're having financial hardship, that's not something that we would be able to assist with. We get a lot of calls too where maybe someone was a victim of crime and now their car has broken down, but it's not related to the crime. So those are the kinds of situations we wouldn't be able to assist with. So it has to be related to the crime. The bills do have to be in the victim's name, or at least have the victim's name on them. So, you know, someone is living with roommates or something like that, or there's a joint bill, that's fine, just as long as the victim's name is on that bill. This really has to be a last resort, so all other options for financial assistance should be explored first, and it has to be, in quotes, timely. Again, that's going to be very dependent on the particular situation. It's not like with victims' comp where it has to be, you know, we have to call us within 72 hours or anything like that. We don't have like a specific time frame, but just keeping in mind that if it's beyond 3 or 4 or 6 months, we're probably going to want to know why, what has changed now that has caused this person to need this emergency fund. If we're paying a portion of an expense, we just want to verify that the remainder has been paid. So that would be in the case of like first month's rent, if there's a deposit, we can't pay the deposit. We would just want confirmation that the deposit is covered or has been paid before we will release the rent check. Or if we're paying maybe a portion of rent, then we would just want to know that the rest of that month's rent has been covered. And that's just so that we're not putting out money and then it's gone and that person is ending up without housing or without that resource. This really is for emergencies, so we are going to want to ensure that these expenses are going to be covered on an ongoing basis. With this funding, there are some circumstances where we may be able to help someone out more than once. So maybe we help with first month's rent, and the next month comes around and that person has 3/4 of the next month's rent and they're working and they're still trying to save up money. We might be able to assist another time with that, but it's really, again, going to be if that really is an emergency circumstance. So it's always worth asking.
So Jen, on that note, someone had actually just asked that question, is if victims can only receive funds once. So I think you just did a great job of already answering that question. But to add to that, would it be like, so maybe 1 month they needed help for rent, maybe the next month, yes, they're able to pay the rent, like you just said. So yes, they're working, they've got rent covered, but now something else happens. Can that be looked at differently? And is that kind of a, well, they've applied twice, is it a 6 times? Like kind of how far could that go?
Yeah, I mean, generally it's going to be a one-time thing. Twice maybe in certain circumstances. I think in most cases probably beyond that we would start getting into that, like, okay, now this person is really experiencing hardship and is unable to keep up with these bills, but it's always worth checking in with us.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and then lastly, we are not able to pay things that victims' comp would pay if the crime was reported. But we can supplement victims' compensation. We can be in lieu of victims' compensation. A lot of the things, so some exceptions to that would be like mental health bills. We are generally not going to be able to cover. But if there are, you know, other things that are outside of the realm of victims' comp that we can assist with, then we may be able to do that. All right. Any other questions before we walk through a couple scenarios? Okay, so the first scenario is a bystander witnesses a homicide and requests victim's compensation for therapy. The witness did not know the parties involved and victim's comp is denying the claim. What do you think? Would we pay out in this circumstance?
All right, so once again, the bystander witnesses a homicide and request victim's compensation for therapy. The witness did not know the parties involved and victim's comp is denying the claim. What are your thoughts? We'll give you just a few seconds, just kidding, 30 seconds or so to answer this poll here. Make sure, again, if you're unsure, you can even feel free to type into the chat box maybe what your question might be about that, or in the chat box. Or if you have other thoughts about that, feel free to type that into there as well. So it looks like we'll give you maybe 10 more seconds to give your thoughts. And again, the scenario is?
A bystander witnesses a homicide and requested victim's compensation to cover therapy. The witness did not know the parties involved, and victim's comp is denying the claim.
Okay. So the way it looks right now, we have about 20% who said yes, 56%, so a little over half, said no, and then another about 20-some-odd% who said they're unsure.
Okay, so in this case, no, we were not able. Generally, we're not going to be able to cover witness expenses. And in this scenario, it was like this person just happened to be on the street and was witness to a homicide. They were just kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, you know, if someone was a witness who was in the home at the time, or was a family member or a close friend of a victim, that may look different, but we're also generally not going to be able to cover those mental health expenses, and we would provide some resources that the advocate could refer to potentially for free or low-cost mental health services in the community. So we're going to do what we can to help ensure that that individual still gets their needs met, but we would not be able to pay for that. Okay, next. Domestic violence victim is preparing to leave her abuser. She has found an apartment and is working with a legal advocate. The most recent incident has been reported to police, and victim's comp has been requested to assist with medical and mental health services, and that application is in process. The advocate is requesting emergency funds to cover first month's rent. Can we pay out on this one?
All right, so we're going to go ahead and launch the poll. And as we do that, we'll have Jen repeat the scenario for us one more time.
Yeah. So a victim of domestic violence is preparing to leave her abuser and has found an apartment. She's working with a legal advocate. The incident has been reported, and so victim's comp has been requested to assist with the medical and mental health services, and that is in process. The advocate is requesting funds to cover first month's rent. Can we do it?
All right, so again, if you have other thoughts, feel free to mark something down there. We're going to give everyone about 10 more seconds to give us your thoughts about this one, and then share back. All right. We're going to go ahead and close the poll. In this particular case, Jen, we've got 93% said yes. We have 4% that were unsure, and then we have about 4% who said other, and a couple thoughts there were yes, if she has a job or a plan to pay ongoing rent, and then someone else made the comment that yes, except if victim's comp can cover it first.
Yes, and so generally victim's comp does not cover rental assistance, which is why we're doing so much of that. But yes, the answer was yes in this circumstance. As long as we had confirmation that the deposit was paid, we were able to pay the landlord directly for first month. And yeah, we just wanted to know that this ongoing expense was going to be able to be covered. In terms of documentation, we would need a copy of the current lease or a new lease, or a lease addendum if it's a renewal, that has the victim and landlord's signature and name and address information, and the amount of rent that we'd be paying. Good work. Okay, couple more here before we finish up. So in this case, we have a victim whose spouse is withholding money that she needs to support herself and 4 children because she reported domestic violence and she's cooperating with an investigation. She's applied for victim's comp for lost support, and that application is pending. She recently started a new job but needs assistance with child care costs in order to continue working. The advocate is also requesting payment for a past due utility bill. What do you all think about this one? Can we pay out on this?
All right, so go ahead and launch that one. We know we are getting to the end and want to do one more quick scenario and leave room for questions. So if you can quickly respond. Jen, if you want to just repeat this one for us one more time.
Yes, so a victim of domestic violence has reported to police and is cooperating in an investigation, and as a result of that, the spouse who was supporting her and her 4 children has cut her off and is withholding funds. She's applied for victim's comp for that lost support, and that's pending. Recently has started a new job, but needs assistance with child care costs in order to continue working.
All right, great. So we're going to give everyone about 10 more seconds. Get your answers in quickly before we get ready to close this one down. And it looks like here, Jen, we've got 20% said yes, 16% said no, 16% said they were unsure, and almost half said other, with comments like yes to child care costs, but not to past due bills. Also someone else who said, so that's the majority of what everyone who said other typed in, but someone did also make a comment about yes as to child care, no to past due utilities, but maybe a way to work around it.
Yeah, great. Good job. So yes and no is the answer here. We were able to provide that assistance with child care as long as we knew that she's able to pay for future bills. So it's summer, maybe the kids are going back to school and that won't be an ongoing need, or she'll be earning enough money to be able to cover that in the future. In order to do that, we need a copy of the child care bill with the name and license number, so it does have to be a licensed child care provider. We were not able to cover the utility bill because it was due prior to the date of the crime and there was a past due balance. So in that case, we would probably recommend that either she works with her utility company to set up a payment plan, or works with the LEAP program, potentially also working with Department of Human Services for child care if that's going to be an ongoing need. But in the meantime, while that's in process, we were able to pay for a month of child care. All right, last one. I think this one is pretty quick. A victim of stalking and harassment is working on getting stable enough so that she can relocate, is getting some help from victim's comp. The defendant is currently in DOC, and the victim is going to enter the address confidentiality program once she's relocated. She's also considering changing her name and social security number as part of the safety plan. Her advocate is requesting emergency funds to pay for the name change, which costs about $200. What do you all think about this one?
All right, so we've launched that poll there. And while that poll is up and you're answering those questions, I do just want to make a quick note, and I apologize, but Claudia, I see that you have your hand raised and have had it raised for a little bit. Not sure if that was intentional or accidental on either your part or my part for missing it, but if you have a question, want to type it into that question box, please feel free to do that, or in just a couple minutes, we'll give everyone an opportunity to unmute themselves and ask questions that way as well. So we're going to go ahead and, oh, thank you, Claudia, for explaining. She said she was having a hard time hearing us, so hopefully that's been cleared up for everyone since then. So we're going to give you about 5 more seconds, and we're going to close this poll down. 3, 2, 1. And here we've got, so we have almost half, 42% saying yes. We have 13% saying no, 42% saying they're unsure what's going to happen. And then we have a couple who said other, and their thoughts were only if not covered by victim's comp.
Okay, so the answer to this one is that we were not able to cover this with VOCA funding. Because it's federal funding, we actually can't use that fund to pay other government agencies. So something like the Social Security or name change, we wouldn't be able to cover. But our smaller COVA fund, we were able to use to cover that expense. So we were able to provide that $200 so that that person could go through with the process of that name change. because we just had less restrictions. And we found that to be a really creative component of the safety plan that we also hadn't really thought about either. So that's one of those kinds of exceptions where the VOCA fund may not be able to cover it, but maybe we can work something out with that other COVA fund. I think that's it for the scenarios. There is contact information here, so our phone number and website. The best people to contact in terms of questions about the emergency fund would be Mandy or Carla. Currently, Mandy is out on medical leave. She'll be back in a couple of weeks, I believe, so Carla's kind of running the show on her own. But she's also checking Mandy's emails and phone messages, so welcome to reach out to either one of those. Also, if you call the office, you can pretty much talk to anyone, and if we don't know the answer, we'll try to get you to someone who can. If you just need an application, we can probably get that to you as well. And I know I personally have been fielding a lot of calls with questions about the emergency fund, so please just feel free to reach out and ask whomever you get a hold of.
All right. So we're going to give everyone just one last quick minute. If you have any other questions, feel free to type them into that question box, or you can raise your hand. We can give you an opportunity to unmute yourself. We do want to be respectful of your time. You will see, too, that I did make a quick note in the chat box that says, and asks all of you, as soon as you close out of this, a survey pops up. I promise, I think it's about 5 questions. We really would love to hear your thoughts and ideas about the brown bag today, the information that Jen shared. We're already getting some great comments from you saying thank you very much for the information and what's been shared today. So we appreciate you doing that and sharing that. But that survey at the end of the brown bag just gives you an opportunity to share a little bit more, not only about today, but future topics that you might be looking for. So we really appreciate you taking about a minute to do that survey as well. So again, someone else saying thank you. Jen, we want to say thank you very much for taking your time to be with us today and actually driving over here to CCADV's offices and being here so you and I could work on this together. Last reminder to everyone, this has been recorded. You will receive a link for the recording. You will also have the slides as well. Again, if you click in the handouts, you'll see the handout there for the emergency fund information sheet that Jen made reference to, and we'll make sure to include that in the email as well. So we've enjoyed our time with you today. We're glad that all of you have enjoyed your time with us as well, and we hope you have a great rest of your week. We'll see you next month at our brown bag. Thank you.
Thank you.